Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to our forward glimpse towards the future of what South Africa may look like in 2030. This webinar is focused on explaining the history as we head towards a destination unknown between now and the end of the decade. My name is Mark McAllister. I'm Senior Partner for Holborn Assets here in Cape Town, and I'll be introducing our speakers shortly. There is a Q&A button at the bottom of your screen for those that haven't used the Zoom webinar feature before. So if you have any questions for the panelists as we go along, please do feel free to ask the questions. We'll also be asking your views and feedback as we go along through the interactive poll features, and that will form the basis of the discussions towards the end of today. What I will do is just to start with a little bit of history on us as a business for those that don't know who we are and where we fit into the world. Just a little bit of background. About 20 years ago, we were formed predominantly in the United Arab Emirates. There is a connection to an old South African financial services business, but our CEO, a guy by the name of Bob Parker, acquired that business and then rebranded as Holborn way back in the late 90s. We've grown then significantly to now the second largest independently owned IFA in the world. To give you an idea of that scale, we're currently managing about $3 billion through 18 offices globally. So the question you might be thinking is, why would people want to do business with Holborn? And there's 5 reasons why we feel that clients want to do business with us. Firstly, as I said, is our size. With that size, we get economies of scale and access to products and solutions that many others simply can't. One thing that we're very proud of, our second point, is the independence of our offering. So we're not beholden to one product provider or one fund. So you'll always find complete independent advice from us, whatever's best for you as the client, with complete impartiality. Thirdly, our service is probably the main reason why I feel it is that clients choose to do business with us. We look after our clients exceptionally well. It has a bit of an old private banking kind of feel. We see our clients every quarter, and what we aim to do is update you on exactly what's going on with markets, what's going on with your portfolios, wherever they are located around the world. Fourthly, the education of our advisors is pivotal to the success of our business. So one of the things that we found is that there's a lot of very capable financial advisors in South Africa. It's a very overbroked market, but our perception is a lot of those financial advisors are more focused on local retirement annuities and local insurance policies, and maybe they're not as well versed on the global opportunities. I had one client say to me that his financial advisor, he felt, didn't know the difference between the NASDAQ and the price of gold. So one of the things that we look to do is step away from that and focus clearly on how our very skilled and qualified advisors can provide you the best-in-class solutions globally. And finally, the safety of your investments is pivotal to what we offer globally. We understand that maybe there's a concern around where assets can and should be placed around the world. So we only use the best-in-class jurisdictions, ones that offer government-backed investor protection, so that they know your money's safe. I can give you an analogy. If we look at South Africa, which we're talking about today, being on the ground floor of a block of flats, then what we might find is that other jurisdictions are above it by as many as 13 floors when it comes to creditworthiness. And one of the questions we have to ask is, where should we be placing our funds to protect ourselves and our families in the future? Okay, moving on. I'd like to introduce our host from the Holborn perspective today. So I'm joined by our Managing Partner for Africa, Lourens Reichert. Lourens not only runs a very successful high net worth private wealth business, he also has oversight for all of our Africa operations, and also within his portfolio is the chairman of our investment selection committee for the $3 billion or so that we look after globally. So very much finger on the pulse, not only on what's going in South Africa, Africa as a whole, but also the whole globe, and how our strategy then fits around that. So Lourens, thank you very much for putting this all together. You really have been the driving force between getting our speaker on today. Over to you.
Hello, everybody. Thank you very much, Mark. Thank you for joining us today. Lovely to have everybody here. I thought I would just give a little bit of history very quickly. I now live in South Africa. I left South Africa in 2002. I went and chased a dream in the UK. It was musical. It wasn't actually corporate. We did very well. And I came back into South Africa 2013, 11 years later. One of the interesting things is that the country had changed dramatically from 2002 to 2013. From the country I left to the country I came, I did not recognize it. I left what I thought was the rainbow nation. Everybody was so rooted together. Everybody was so happy, and I came back to a completely different country. The rhetoric had changed. The racial tensions had changed. Everything changed really in South Africa. I did not really recognize the country, but the stark difference was I left South Africa when I was earning a certain amount of money, and I realized when I came back that same amount of money now is almost worthless. If I earned the same amount of money, the depreciation of the currency was quite shocking. And the industry that we now work in, we've realized that the currency, the depreciation of that currency, the inflation, the taxation has crippled most middle-class people in terms of their wealth, especially retirees, which is the industry we work in. And as the last 8 years have gone by, one of the things that have struck me is that people have been afraid to speak. And the main thing is you're branded as some sort of right-winger or whatever if you actually say something against the governing power or anything like that. You're also considered or branded anti-patriotic or whatever the case might be. But that has changed recently. And most recently, everybody would have seen the Rob Hersov blow up when he was in the Drakensberg, where he talked quite openly about how he feels about people and government, etc. But a particular video of Dr. Frans Cronje came across from one of my colleagues. And this video spoke very, very clearly about the past, where we are and where we're headed to. And the past that he described is the same past that I came from, and the present he described was the same present I was sitting in, and it is the exact same future that we saw. And based on that video, I reached out, I said, listen, can we please chat? A very interesting chat that we had. I said, look, it was a different South Africa from when I left to when I came back. And I am so pro South Africa, but I'm so anti leaving money in this country. I cannot fathom why you would leave your wealth in this country. It makes no commercial sense to me whatsoever. And he said, well, you know what, Lourens, most people, when they ask us to present, they ask us to sugarcoat things. And the last thing I want is a sugar-coated future. I want the truth because that's the only way one can plan. And so he kindly said that he would, with his team, jump on a webinar with our clients, with our prospects, and share with them the history of this country, the present of this country, and where they predict our country to be within the next decade. And one thing I'll say is he's been very, very good at predicting our currency the last however many decades he's been doing this. And this is the stuff that we work with on a daily basis. So I won't say much more about that. And I would love to introduce Dr. Frans Grenier to everybody to speak about what he would like to speak about. He was obviously, and as we can see here, he was educated at St. John's College and at Wits University, holds a PhD in scenario planning. The Institute of Race Relations is a public think tank that was established in 1929 to promote human rights in South Africa. The Center of Risk Analysis was established in 2010, and he advises on global and South Africa political, economic, social, and policy risk. And he has authored 3 fantastic books if you haven't had the opportunity to read them. So without any further ado, I present to you Dr. Frans Cronje.
There we go. Hi, everyone. And Lourens, thanks for that. Mark, thanks for getting me here. I'll just get myself on screen for you, and then I'll tell you what we're going to do. Right. You should all be seeing me. Let me get a laser pointer up, or a pen, rather. There, it's a pen. I can draw for you and show you things. What I'm going to do for you. And we're going to do it pretty quickly in the next 40 minutes or so. I'm going to talk you through a series of charts that my colleagues construct for me that should give you a sense of what is happening in South Africa now, why it's happening, and what's going to happen next. And at intervals through that, I'm going to try and give you a sense of where we stand in terms of the long history of the country, and why that's such a useful analytical tool to get a sense of what's coming back. The order of things that I'm going to take you through, we're going to start with number one. There's just been an election. ANC's at 46%. It's important. Take you through what happened there. The key metros, these are the big urban municipalities. I'm going to show you what's happening there. I'll give you an update on the negotiations about the coalitions to lead them. Then I'll give you what people in South Africa are thinking and wanting. That's an important ingredient to get a sense of what's going to happen next. Structural constraints on growth and reform. Will the ANC reform under pressure? I'll give you a firm answer on that one. What are the implications for the economy? And number 6, the Holy Grail. What's going to happen next? So let's get underway. Local government elections happened 10 days ago. ANC support falls to below 50% for the first time. The pollsters had that right. You're looking at a chart here. A number of polls, Ipsos, they're a polling group, September 2020. Ourselves, our own numbers, December 2020, Ipsos, August 21, and ourselves in September of this year. On the ANC, we all had it in the same place, sitting at just on 49%. Our forecast for this election was ANC 49, so we were a bit high. They came in at 46. The DA figures, we got those right in the polls right at the end, came on just on 21%. The EFF, we were on the money as well. In Carter, ASA, that's the small startup of Herman Mashaba. Looks like it got very little, or the polls had it at very little, but it only contested a number of urban municipalities where it did exceptionally well, and other parties. So going into this, no surprises about the local result. These kinds of polling numbers for the ANC used to sit in the 60s. When I started my career, they fell into the high 50s a couple of years ago. They're now down to 50, and I can see them over the next decade falling to 40 and below. Behind those numbers, there's a broad shift in the country's politics that this chart that you're going to see now does quite well to bring out. The years run from 94, the dawn of South Africa's democracy, into the present. And what my analyst colleagues have done is they start you with these red bars. This is economic growth, so that you have something that you can hang the country's politics on. And the short history is a recovery in the aftermath of 94 and an economic collapse after 2007. The ANC over that era is this yellow line. Its support will rise for a decade, peaking at almost 70% in 2004. It then steps down and down and down again. The last step is the recent local government poll. It's not strictly comparable to the previous elections that are national, but it just gives you a sense of how the trajectory is moving. And the relevant quote there is from Hemingway in The Sun Also Rises, where the one chap in the book says to his colleague, how did you go bankrupt? And he says, well, slowly, and then first slowly and then very fast. And that is how political parties lose control of countries. That's the Democratic Alliance, the official opposition's performance. Week into the most recent national poll, a bit of a recovery into the local poll, but in fact more of a recovery than it seems, because many DA votes have gone to smaller opposition parties. They've stayed in the broad opposition bloc. They haven't moved to the ANC. There are the young economic freedom fighters, the radical upstarts, wish to nationalize everything in sight. They struggle to get above, sustained support above 10%, significant in a country where more than half of people, young people, do not have a job. Take these radical upstarts, the EFF, and put them back into the ANC, which is where they belong. And an impression is created. At first, that going into the most recent national election in 2019, the broad ANC-EFF bloc was holding together. I'm going to show you later that that was misleading in and of itself, because the number of the proportion of voter turnout levels were falling very quickly, particularly for the ANC. The black solid line is the performance of the broader opposition in South Africa. So that's this kind of ideological political opposition to the kind of slightly left of center to extremely left of center, statist, a racial nationalist approach to policy and governance of the ANC. And it looked for an era. Many analysts would tell their clients this as if this block of opposition parties were going nowhere. But that was misleading, again, because of what we were seeing in voter turnout levels that I'm going to show you in a little bit. That bloc has seen a vast climb. It's catching up to the broader ANC-EFF bloc, and it heralds something important come the national election in 2024. In these most recent polls, the local government polls of 10 days ago, aggregate support levels for the ANC compared to the most recent national, prior to that, 2016 national poll, is down about 14%. That's not percentage points, that's a percentage drop. The number of people turning out to vote are way down. Number of councils controlled down. Number of the number of councils the ANC controls is way down. And it's lost about 1,000 seats. These were ANC politicians who would have had jobs on local councils. The effect of that, the loss of control and the loss of the seats, is going to create enormous internal conflict within that party as the fractious factions turn on each other. My colleagues made some notes for me. Below 50% now for the first time. We think it probably sticks there. Still the biggest group, but it's unable to secure majorities in the major urban centers at all. And I'm going to show you those in a bit. In fact, across urban South Africa, ANC support now sits at just 34%, and it won't come back. It is the largest party in the rural provinces, by far the largest, of the northwest of Limpopo, the Free State, and Mpumalanga, and the Northern Cape. It is ruralizing, the same as happened to ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe 20 years ago. It's hurt significantly. This is local. This is another chart. Local poll years in which local elections took place, and what you must look at is the proportion of registered voters that voted, and then the proportion of people over the age of 18 that voted. And the most recent turnout figures are low, but they're not historically low relative to where we were 20 years ago. And the senior ANC leader said to me on the election, he said it's not such a problem because turnout was so low, and that's what really sunk us. If that had been higher, we'd have been okay. He is quite wrong on the facts of it. And the deep polling showed us as well that had turnout been very much higher, let's say near 100%, which is completely artificial, ANC support in this election would not have come in at 46%, would have come in at closer to 42%. Now, as this has happened to the ANC, behind it sits a really interesting collection of trend lines. The years are 94 to 2019, and we're going to look at, firstly, the number of people, these are the red dots, that voted for the ANC. These are in national elections. And then the number of eligible voters that did not vote, and look how those lines pull apart from each other. And a third line, you read this one off the right-hand axis, the number of violent protest actions in South Africa. And as the ANC vote stagnates and the proportion of people who can't vote takes off, that drives the rise in violent protest action. And it was in fact off that black line that we called for our clients on a number of occasions the year before it happened, the recent explosions and the mini insurrection in KwaZulu-Natal. Don't think you need to take too many notes on this stuff. I'm very happy to send these charts on to Holborn, and they can forward them on to you if they choose to do so. Now, urban South Africa, that's where the middle classes are. That's where the bulk of GDP is produced. This is the economic heartland of Southern Africa. The ANC is doing terribly badly. The Ekurhuleni, a metropolitan municipality that sits on the fringe of Johannesburg, 2016, the ANC had 109 seats there. It's now at 86 of a total of 224 seats in that council. You can start to see, if you do these figures, 86 out of 224, you see how the ANC urban vote now sits at only around 30%, artificially high, held there by rural turnout levels. Then Pretoria municipality, Tshwane, ANC down from 89 to 75. What may happen there, the deal has to be struck tomorrow, in fact, is that if the DA lends its support to the Action SA party in Johannesburg to form a minority government, ASA will put the DA in charge with a majority, leading a majority coalition in Pretoria. In Johannesburg, the likelihood now is that you're going to see a series of rounds of voting for mayors. In each round, the candidate with the least votes gets knocked out. That's likely to end sometime next week in a position where an ANC candidate stands off against an Action South Africa candidate. If the DA lends its support to the ASA candidate, the Action South Africa candidate, Action South Africa leads an opposition bloc into a minority government in Johannesburg and puts the DA in power in Pretoria. On the east coast of Natal, the Inkatha Freedom Party is going to make a deal with the ANC and leave the ANC in charge in that province. Don't read that as a coalition, it's not. A deal has been struck between the two, that where one has a plurality of votes, the ANC and the EFF, that one will be allowed to govern unhindered by any of the others. Also on the coast, Nelson Mandela Bay municipality, this is an amazing result. What's going to happen here is that opposition bloc of parties, that opposition to the sort of ANC economic freedom fighters, sort of slightly Marxist dogmatic bloc, the opposition to that, the more what you might think reform-minded bloc, they're going to get 60 of 120 seats in Nelson Mandela Bay. If the economic freedom fighters abstain from supporting the ANC there, which is what they've promised to do, that 60 bloc will control that municipality. In that case study, you see how volatile and unstable these urban coalitions are going to be. They're likely to remain so for quite some time to come. Takeaways from us. From the local polls, low voter turnout. It's indicative of dissatisfaction, but it does not provide an excuse for the ANC's low support. It's getting smoked politically regardless of turnout levels. It's the watershed moment, this ANC below 50%. We made the call in 2012. The ANC goes below 50% in 2024. At the time, we were told it's absurd. It's happened 2 years ahead of what even our out on a limb call was. Overall support for a fragmented opposition is growing very fast. And this is the critical point. It is possible in 2 years' time that broader opposition bloc that's cobbling together these haphazard, unstable coalitions, that bloc collectively might have a national majority. And if so, take charge of the South African government. And if they do that, this is the South Africa reform scenario, horizon, window materializing. The reform emerging out of the ANC, I'll get to that later, was never going to happen. Local interest parties are hurting the larger parties. They're complaining. They're going to have to make peace with that, because that is the future. It's a sort of a fragmentation of opposition politics. Pull them together into one, though, front of organizations. You've got the formula for reform in South Africa. The next couple of steps, I'll go through these quickly for you. South Africans checking out of the formal electoral process, and where you saw that happen on the previous chart, you get a lot more violent protest action. They expect that that's going to happen more. ANC below 50 in 2024. That is the reform horizon for South Africa. And that reform movement is going to be led by these fragmented, smaller opposition parties. If you think of the ANC as a buffalo roaming the African savannah, and if you thought, many analysts have been looking for a lion that would come along and catch the buffalo and kill it. There's not going to be a lion. There's going to be a pack of wild dogs. And that's these smaller fragmented opposition parties. That is the norm. It can be highly unstable. It will be so for the short term. Into the medium term, if it holds together, South Africa starts to look very, very interesting. And the ANC becomes a sort of rural fallback party, similar to ZANU-PF in Zimbabwe. What about people? What do they want and what do they think? Well, they're not happy at all. This is polling, it's ours, it comes out of 2021. Do you think your life is better or worse than 5 years ago? 57.5% of people thought it was worse. And that explains why so much ANC support has been falling away, because we've been seeing that middle, that worst bar grow and grow and grow year after year, over more than a decade. The most serious problem in the country, what do you need for your life to get better? These are the answers from people. The big one, it's always that, is jobs and unemployment. I'll show you some insights later into our labor market. They are astonishing. You see the very low level of participation in that market compared to other emerging markets. Then abuse of women and children came in high in this poll. We think it's a proxy for crime, and we polled at the same time as a campaign highlighting such abuse. So I think that's what you're seeing there. Then corruption, electricity, load shedding, education, water, basic services. Down at the bottom of the list are the populist political questions, land reform, more Black economic empowerment, the problem of racism. These things come at the bottom. And the reason why the ANC is losing is because its focus, and that of the radical fringe parties, is on the stuff at the bottom of the list, where South Africans want delivery on the stuff at the top of the list. Right. But that said, and South Africans are very unhappy. There's a facet, there's a sort of an angle to that's important to understand. It does not extend to how they view each other, that unhappiness. And this I'm going to rely on heavily in the conclusions I'm going to draw for you later. Do you believe, is the question, poll question, it's our polling, that relations between people of different races in South Africa have improved since 1994? And these are the answers in red out of 2020. And those are the answers out of 2021. Now, a plurality in 2020, a majority again in 2021 think things are better. Only around a quarter of people, let's go to the side, far right, only about a quarter, or the second columns from the right, only about a quarter of people think things have become worse. And again, roughly a quarter think that they have stayed broadly the same, and the same is off the heady moment of liberation in 1994, when for a number of years things went quite well here. Massive public dissatisfaction with circumstances, with economic trajectory and the like, but not deep internal tensions between people. And that is a necessary condition. It must remain so for this fragmented wild dog pack of opposition parties to take the government in 2024 and turn the place around. How do people see political leaders? I'm just going to show you here a vulnerability for the ANC. It doesn't look so at first, but I'll show you why it is. This is also polls. This is also, I believe this is our stuff. Different political leaders, Mr. Ramaphosa, the Steenhuisen, he runs the DA. Malema, he runs the fringe radical populist splinter from the ANC. Dr. Buthelezi, who runs Inkatha and Natal. Peter Groenewald, he runs a small minority Afrikaner interest party. And Herman Mashaba, the businessman, went into politics and has done so well with Action South Africa. The green bars are, do you view these people favorably? And look at Mr. Ramaphosa's favorability ranking at 60%. And if you're following me very closely, you'll see something. His popularity is higher than the 50% at which we and Ipsos are polling the ANC. He's more popular than his party, which means he's artificially keeping it in the high 40 percentiles in elections. If he goes, ANC support falls to 40% and below, and they wash out of the South African political system. Do you regard this person unfavorably? Those are the red bars. And then you get a net score, net favorability of a political leader. Only one chap has a positive net score. That's Mr. Ramaphosa. And are you unfamiliar with them? This is a problem for some of the major opposition parties. Look at John Steenhuisen, 45% in the DA. But that's something good marketing can set right. And it's a threat to the ANC, therefore. Now, Mr. Ramaphosa came to power promising new dawn reforms, and we said to our clients, those will not happen. He's not a reformer in the main. But what does the public think about his reforms a couple of months ago? 65% of people said that the president is trying hard to introduce reforms. He's just being held back by some sort of recalcitrant elements. Only a third thought it was an empty promise. Our view is it is an empty promise. And the risk here for the ANC is that if we're right in that call and reforms don't manifest and confidence in Mr. Ramaphosa collapses from this very high 60%, the implications for the ANC's voter performance is obvious. And you can't fool all the people all the time. Do you think the corruption identified at the Zondo Commission, this is a commission investigating corruption of the past decade, will be effectively prosecuted and the guilty punished? 50% of South Africans said they thought so. We're pretty sure that's not going to happen. And when that view begins to dominate, that it's not going to happen, the confidence falls. It's the same. And confidence in Ramaphosa therefore falls. The effect on ANC support becomes very obvious. Do you think that state capture, that was the term to describe the corruption of the Zuma era, is that over now? Only 16% of people say yes, which shows that they realize it still haunts us. 70% say no. They're still waiting for it to be beaten. Fail at that, which Ramaphosa, my call advice to you would be, is going to fail at. His confidence in him collapses, and then the ANC is indeed in very grave trouble. It is already in such trouble. So is it going to reform to try and save itself? Our short answer to you is it will not. This has nothing to do with opposition to reform within the ANC or the fact that Mr. Ramaphosa is too weak, therefore, politically, to drive reforms. In our estimate, it'll take a while to explain how we got there, so I'll just give you the data, is that within the broader ANC caucus, which includes, in our definition, the EFF party that split off from the ANC, the radical populists, of that broader caucus in Parliament, about 168 votes should comfortably end up in favor of Mr. Ramaphosa, 62 from the ANC opposed to Mr. Ramaphosa, and 44 from the EFF opposed to Mr. Ramaphosa. So even if you put the EFF back into the ANC, he's still got a 60% plus majority on any policy question he wishes to push. Strip the EFF out of the ANC, because it's not in the ANC, his majority rises to 70%. This stuff that he's not powerful enough to drive reforms, it doesn't work on the maths of it. What does begin to explain why reform is not likely imminent is two other things. Firstly, corruption, then ideology. Let's start with the corruption. The ANC is run by an executive committee that's got 80 ordinary members, and we did a background checks on the 80, and those checks implicated 41 of them in acts of serious corruption. That's a majority of the board, essentially. Only 8 were cleared in our minds, and on 31, we could not make a call one way or the other. Let's say that 31 gets split 50-50. The implication is that 3/4 of the senior executive leadership of the ANC could be sent to prison for corruption if the country was one day well governed. And that will remain a dead stop on the kinds of governance reforms and prosecutions that the public is yearning for Mr. Ramaphosa to introduce. On the question of ideology, we, an old organization, we follow people closely, we profile them in great detail. What do we think of the potential for reform emerging from this cabinet? This is an estimate we did a couple of months back. It broadly holds true even now. We thought of the cabinet, so of full ministers, 81 were in practice, they're the orange ones, anti-reform. They would not introduce the hard labor empowerment and property rights reforms for South Africa to be a highly competitive market. 19 possibly open to reform. There used to be one who was pro-fundamental reform. He was the finance minister, but he's not with us anymore. He's been replaced by Mr. Godongwana. So client says to us, why is there no reform? It's so obvious. Look at the performance of the economy. One of our answers is because this is in practice not a reformist administration. It does not believe in the merits of reform. Another break so the absence of reform is a break on economic performance. Another one is what's happening in Eskom, which is in very serious trouble. The chart here runs from 2011 to 2021. And what I'm showing you in green is called the energy availability factor. That is what proportion of installed capacity is available to be produced as electricity to flow into a home or business. And the trend line there is sharply downwards. The 2021 figure year to date is averaging this year. Go to recent months and you can chop a good 10 percentage points off it. It's falling because of what this red line is doing. It's called the unplanned outage factor. Isn't that a good political term for things that break down? The infrastructure is failing and the maintenance efforts are not reversing that. We think Andre de Ruyter is a good guy and we think he's doing his level best, but the odds against him are too great. What he's inherited was too far gone, and Eskom cannot be seen again as a solution to the energy demands that would be required if South Africa is over the next decade to look to emulate the average growth rates of emerging markets. Eskom just puts a hard cap, hard ceiling on growth. Of course, that means a hard ceiling on jobs and improved living standards. Of course, that means that ANC support continues to be depressed and the ANC loses an election. Another hard cap on growth, and in a sense one that stands as an obstacle to reform, is what's happening in South Africa's schools. The chart you've got here on the left-hand axis has children, school children, numbers of 200,000, 400,000 out to 1.2 million. What my colleagues have done for you is they have shown you the progress of a child, essentially, through South Africa's school system. So in grade 1, the first year of formal schooling in 2009, there were 1.1 million kids enrolled. 10 years later, you see them again. They're the grade 10 class, 2 years before graduating high school. They're the class of 2018, so they're the same age cohort, and most of them are still there. They've made it through their first 10 years of schooling. But between grade 10 and 11 and 12, the last year of high school, about half of children will drop out of school. Only 570,000 went on to write their school leaving exams. Only 440,000 passed those at standards dumbed down under political pressure to a point where they're meaningless. Only 210,000 kids qualified for further study at university. And the number, the stonker, is 50,000 kids are graduating math in high school with a grade of 50% or higher in South Africa's schools, in an economy with a structure of GDP has for many decades, predating 94, been working itself away from primary and secondary industries towards the high-tech, high-skilled services economy. And the skills base means that given the nature of labor market policy, the ANC can't put young people into jobs before you even get to the problem of Eskom and growth. And that is the political Achilles heel that will kill that party, be very instrumental in killing that party off. So if reform isn't coming, if there's not enough electricity, if the skills base is flawed, what is the outlook? Well, here's the finance minister, the new chap, in his medium-term budget about a week ago. You're looking at growth rates. These are the rates that were announced by the finance minister in his budget speeches since 2005. And look how South African finance ministers have become more and more and more pessimistic over time. Mr. Godongwana is the most pessimistic of them all. He's predicting growth of 1.5% now on the 3-year view. I'll show you now why that might be a bit optimistic. And you must think of this. No one is better positioned to understand whether reform is imminent and whether Eskom's problems can be relieved than the Minister of Finance. And if he's telling you the growth rate is going to be 1.6% on the 3-year view when emerging markets are forecast to grow at nearer to 5%, what he's telling you is there is no reform on the way. His forecast, or finance minister's forecast in general, you should be a bit skeptical of. The orange bars are the actuals that materialized in the year in question. And you can see over the past decade how finance ministers were talking the thing up to the point of dishonesty when the fundamentals to support the levels of growth they were predicting simply did not exist. The same danger attaches itself to Mr. Godongwana's latest forecasts. Now let's go back a bit into the history to see why historically what I'm kind of leading you towards, I mean the argument I'm creating I think has real legs. The chart here runs from 1960 to 2021. And what I show you is economic growth in South Africa. High growth era collapses on the political instability of the 1970s. The low growth era precipitates the reforms and negotiations of the 1990s. A very strong recovery in the first decade of democracy. And on the departure of Mr. Mbeki as South Africa's leader, the ANC turns from a policy perspective hard to the left, and the global financial crisis coincides with that, and South Africa's performance falls away. It's not about to recover, and we know that because of this, the black line. It's a lead indicator produced by the central bank. And it has been, if you go to all the peaks and take your eyes up to the growth rates and the troughs and down to the growth rates, it's a perfect predictor on a sort of 3-year view or so. It's meant to be an 18-month view. It works in about 3 years too, of South Africa's likely future economic performance. The lead indicator since 2007, so pre the financial crisis, or you can start it after the crisis, has been in its longest flat to negative trajectory on record. It is the predictor of medium-term performance, meaning that the finance minister could not have suggested a growth rate of much above the 1.5% that he forecast for us about a week or so ago. Right. Now, the implications of this. 94 to 2024 is the time frame. What you're looking at first is expenditure, a government expenditure as a share of GDP, then government revenue as a share. The difference between them is the budget deficit. This is the forecast by the minister now, that he's going to rein in that deficit. He's going to do it with a growth rate of 1.6%, and also by cutting expenditure into a political window where his party stands to lose an election. I think it's too tough an ask to do, and deficits are likely to wallow at levels somewhat deeper than those projected by the Treasury. Go back in time, and let's go now to 1970 and into 2024 and look at South Africa's budget deficit. And what you see is the present position, even where the minister's forecasts are reached, replicates the kinds of figures that South Africa experienced in the aftermath of Soweto in 1976 and the volatile 1980s thereafter that set up the democratic transition. This is the same pattern we saw in the data in the aftermath of the Second and First World Wars, both of which, particularly the second and the defeat of Smuts in 1948, were important in bringing about political transitions Running out of money changes politics in free societies, even in closed societies. And this deficit, with the poor growth outlook forecast by the minister, read against my comments due on the likelihood of fundamental reform, is a further piece of buttressing for the argument that it's in the election of 2024 that South Africa can pivot. These are the debt forecasts coming out of the state. This was the 2021 budget forecast. Well, the numbers run from 2016. The forecast is going into the next few years. It's a very positive thinking that's going on here, that the debt curve line, look how it's escalated into the last year, is going to be flattened, and then it's going to moderate into a bit of a plateau. Given the political pressure ahead for the ANC, politically, I don't think that's going to be sustained. It's going to be hard to sustain it. You probably see debt levels running towards 100% of GDP over the next 2 to 3 years. The price for that, you guys know this stuff well. Look at debt servicing costs. Now, these figures are beginning to rival major areas of government expenditure, such as education and the like. And the Hemingway quote becomes important about how it just all starts to go wrong at the same time. Your political support tails off, you run out of fiscal road, your internal cohesion begins to destabilize, and you get to the election in 2024 in that kind of shape. Related to that is the shortcomings of a model of government and development that really came out of 2007, that to a far too greater extent has prioritized welfare-driven governance ahead of jobs, and the political price for that is something the ANC is now paying. This is the number of social grants paid every month in South Africa from 1996. And look at that huge lift. That was the 350 Rand a grant that came out of the COVID pandemic. Then the number of people who are employed, and there's 2000 and here we get into position from around 2007. It first happens in around 29, where we get more people on welfare than there are in employment. And that employment figure includes the informal sector. And it works politically for a time. It helps to shore up your support. But in the end, it doesn't matter what you do. This kind of dependency breeds massive political frustration with the source of the funds, with the state itself, and helps to bring about its longer term demise. I did ask on a chart, almost this chart, a chap I can't name for you, but very senior in the management of the country's economy, is this enough for you to turn on labour market policy? And the chap said to me, he thinks it's a hell of a chart, but there's little prospect of from an ideological perspective, the cabinet entertaining policy reforms that have the potential to address this. That is an extraordinary remark that was made to me, because what you're looking at here, South Africa's on the far right, New Zealand on the left, Japan, Australia, Canada, a couple of others, Chile, third from the right, is something called the labour market absorption rate. It measures what proportion of people of working age are absorbed into the labour market and work. The figure for South Africa in the second quarter of this year, there's no precedent for this. There's no one else like this. This low level of formal economic participation, and it must give rise to high levels of protest. We've seen those couple of big explosions like Natal, and ultimately a political realignment. And it is exactly that I think is on the way for us. And to tell you how it happens, I have for you these a few little scenario charts. Then I'm done. Now I'll hopefully be almost on time for you too. In our team, about 2-3 years ago, we built a new scenario set for South Africa. And one of the axes we used to determine, though, to draw the matrix that we build the scenarios on, was the question of, will the ANC keep its majority above 50%, or will it fall to below 50%? And while that happens, will South Africa see an effective reform strategy from whoever governs it, or will no such strategy be forthcoming? And how those two questions were answered create 4 quadrants, each of them a direction in which the country could move. The most positive, this was the new dawn line. This was what Mr. Ramaphosa was meant to do. The ANC would stay above 50 and grow because his government was reformist in nature. They would introduce sweeping reforms and we would see a recovery. The second outcome for us was defeat in economic reform. The ANC needs to fall below 50 for someone else to come along and introduce an effective reform strategy. That's been our decade-long call on the country. It is, in a sense, what has happened just 10 days ago. The worst case for South Africa was the ANC falls below 50 and there's no reform strategy. The state retreats become a pretty anarchic part of the world as the state retreats, vacuums are formed that are filled by all kinds of non-state actors and some of them a bit nasty. And the fourth one we developed for clients was how can the ANC stay above 50 despite not introducing reforms? Now, the short detail on all of these, and then I'm done for you, works like this. We did these very simple little circular charts. If it's reform and recovery, the new dawn, sweeping labor empowerment, energy and education, property rights reforms are about to be announced. As a consequence of those, growth is going to climb back to around 5% by the end of this decade. Debt, etc., dip away. You know all of that. Living standards, therefore, resume the positive trajectory they were on into 2007. Remember, I showed you how the growth rate lifted, how ANC support, in fact, in 2004, in that election, was higher than it had been when Mandela led the country to liberation 10 years before that. Confidence in the ANC rises again. It's firmly in charge. South Africa is a competitive emerging market. It's all pretty good. Defeat and reform. This is the probability for me. Reform is not coming, despite events such as this election result, the blackouts of Eskom, etc. The ANC majority goes to below 50% in 2024. We get into 5 years of unstable coalition. That's what we're now seeing at local level. 2029, a new political player comes to dominate that coalition. It's still a coalition, but someone can hold it all together. They introduce, through the coalition, sweeping structural reforms, and South Africa becomes a truly competitive and great place to be. What must be avoided is bottom left. Reform is delayed. ANC is below 50. That triggers a populist nationalist coalition. It's expropriation across the board, nationalization of industry. All the key indicators blow out and living standards collapse. Civil rights get absolutely hammered as people begin to rise up against their collapsing standards of living. And lastly, can the ANC stay in power without reform? If it does, it's got to do it this way. No reform, it's not going to reform. Economic exclusion deepens. The ANC capitalizes on that frustration and anger to hold majorities, a lot of populist rhetoric and the like. It kind of became very hard to kind of make the internal coherence of the scenario work for us. So we put in this block. That can only possibly succeed, block 3, if the opposition flounders, is deeply divided and actually turns on itself. And in that case, South Africa can continue with an ANC majority government underperforming its EM peers for a considerable period of time. There is no fifth scenario. What's going to happen in South Africa is going to fall into one of these 4 quadrants. My call for you this morning is it's likely to be bottom right. And Lourens and colleagues, that's it from me. In what time we have, I'll happily try and help you to answer some questions. Thanks for getting me in. Thanks for listening to what we had to say.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Frans. It was super insightful. Ladies and gentlemen, we've obviously been asking a number of questions via our poll system, and I'm just going to link in from what we were just looking at there about, what is your belief about the future after everything that you've heard? And I think really what we're saying is that let's imagine ourselves in 2030, looking back to today. And really, there's kind of 2 polar opposite scenarios and maybe some steps either side of those. And And if I may, I describe the sort of the worst case scenario, picking up on the threads there from Dr. Grenier, and that's saying that, what if we end up potentially going the way of Zimbabwe? There is civil unrest, there is no food on the shelves, there's no fuel, all that sort of stuff. So that's the worst case scenario. I think at the other end of the scale, if we're going to say 0 to 10, so at 10, it's going to be that we go the way of Singapore, so probably, as you were saying there, Doctor, without the ANC at the helm, maybe a new political party, possibly. And let's call that the Singapore scenario. So I'm going to ask our audience here to start voting. Where do you see South Africa in 2030 on the sort of 1 to 10 scale? And it'll be very interesting to see where everyone positions themselves. Lourens, while we're just getting those results in before we go on to the results of the other polls, what's your view on this and everything that we've discussed and seen so far?
Well, firstly, I just wanted to say thank you, Mark, for excellent presentation, and then definitely to Frans for just very insightful. My WhatsApp has been blowing up from clients and colleagues just saying, wow, excellent. And obviously the stats are, I think Warren Buffett said, I don't mind to get into an argument as long as I know the stats and the facts, And so the stats and the facts are hard to run away from. You can't really go away from it. My quick question is, and this is a very, very hard one to answer, and this is to Frans. And I'm sorry for saying this, but was there ever a turning point in this country through history where it could have had a different turnout to where we are today?
Well, I mean, you've got to understand why countries change. And change only happens at points of crisis. And the direction of the change follows the side of whichever political or ideological faction that injected the greatest volume of compelling argument into the public mind. So South Africa gets into very deep trouble in the 1960s after Sharpeville, and then in 76 in Soweto again. It's bailed out by the gold price in the early 80s. But a vast lobby has been put together at the time to push it towards reform. And the joint crises of 1985, that was the speech made by the then head of state, who said to hell with reform, while Chase Manhattan refused to roll over the country's loans, coinciding with the collapse of the Berlin Wall 4 years later, allowed the transition to democracy to happen. And for a decade, we did well. I didn't dwell on that today because otherwise I talk for hours and hours. But in the decade between 94, democracy, and 2004, South Africa roughly doubled the number of people in employment. You'll see that in one of the jobs charts I showed you. Living standards really took off. And initial service delivery efforts by the ANC were much more successful than they were given credit for. Growth rose to average 5% between 2004 and 7, which is the first time that had happened for that number of years. 4 years of 5% growth since, I think, 1970 was the last year of the last 4-year 5% growth environment. And we produced a budget surplus, despite rolling out the largest welfare program of any emerging market. It was pretty good. But behind the scenes, there was a lot of ideological and political agitation that the ANC had turned to the right, driven by its internal ideological allies. And South Africans had become complacent. The hard legwork to secure the gains of 94 was not being done. And in 2007, internally in the ANC, the reformist, enlightened side of that party loses a vote. It's as simple as that, 40-60. Thabo Mbeki, who'd inherited the momentum that Mandela had afforded to South Africa's turnaround, he's the architect of it, is gone. And South Africa turns to a lesser or greater extent to the ideological left. So that was the great lost opportunity. It did not need to happen. And I can tell you it was damn frustrating watching it happen and predicting that it would happen and not seeing a counter. Now a new great opportunity has presented itself. There is no lion coming to take down the buffalo. There aren't. Lions are unusual in politics now more than ever. Politics must become more granular. consumers of any product demand a more granular, fragmented offering. Politics will go the same way. And if this pack of wild dogs, rather, that has taken the ANC down 10 days ago, can keep itself together and stay on the sort of pragmatic, centrist path that it's on, that will resonate with public opinion. Because I showed you the public's mostly, they feel fed up with their own circumstances, but they generally get on well with each other. And what they want from the world is the pragmatic job kind of growth, investment-led growth and job creation, not the populist rhetoric that comes out of the ANC. And this is a truly great opportunity. And it is so great that I, with a reputation, I think, over the years for being a bit of a hawk, can tell you if this comes off, South Africa's reform scenario, I think, is now 896 or 93 days away. That's the date of the next election. And you could have a reformist administration in power. It is an opportunity that must not be allowed to slip. But I am worried that very few groups we talk to see it, and even less are inclined to believe us, that this is the route to reform. They tend to fall back in the idea that strengthening the ANC and Mr. Ramaphosa is the route to reform. We were skeptical of that from the beginning, and I think the evidence of the last 3 years has borne out that skepticism. It's a long answer, but it's a hell of an important question. And the answer is one of the most positive things I suppose I've said to any group for the last 15 years. Chaps, thank you.
Fantastic. Okay, thank you for that. And the answers to our polls that's sort of coming in now. So the very interesting one, I think, to start with is the sentiment of the future of South Africa. So of the nearly 200 people that are watching and participating today, only 17% of them rate the future of South Africa higher than the flip of a coin, if we use that very simplistic way of splitting it. So it's what we would call like a net promoter score in our industry. Are you generally positive or generally negative? And only 17% are in the sort of generally positive. So the vast majority generally negative on the future of South Africa. So Lourens, I think let's just segue into a question here from one of the participants. So this is from Jan. What is your long-term view on the dollar? I mean, given its declining status as a reserve currency and continued money printing, of the Federal Reserve, is the current inflation in the US only transient? And what's the knock-on effect for the rand?
I don't think it's transient. I think 40 years of what we might call in our team financial socialism that started in financing the US trade partners' deficits with the US by printing dollars after the fall of the Berlin Wall will eventually run out of road. And so when we ask clients to think about their place in the world, we ask them to factor in the extent to which a significant markets pullback at some point in the next decade could be a catalyst for the political events that they're watching. So we wouldn't be surprised to see such a pullback. The effect on the dollar, of course, is almost impossible to say, because the uncertainty that this will bring could see a rush back into dollar assets. So even though it's triggered out of the dollar, you could see the dollar coming back fairly strongly. On the rand, if that's, from a South African perspective, the flip side of that is that we see, given over the next 3 years into the election of 2024, the trajectory must be from South African fundamentals, one of the rand weakening somewhat further, held up for a time, of course, by the interest rate differential, but that may begin to close. And held up for a time by sentiment that is, I think, on the fact wrong on the reform inclinations of Ramaphosa. So the rand, we're negative. On the dollar, probably in the long term, even after such a pullback, we can sustain an argument that you actually see a rush back into dollar assets. And so it's contrary to what initially you might think has to happen in the event of a global pullback. But as in the case that the collapse of the Berlin Wall was the catalyst that allowed the crises in South Africa to translate into a political realignment, if that pullback, global pullback, happens now, the effect on South Africa as a sort of emerging market asset and the pain that will bring to households here might just be the catalyst that ensures that the political transition that I have predicted for you plays out, not just plays out, but might go back to Hemingway. It's such an important quote. Play out faster and more dramatically than you can imagine. And in your poll here, you do an interesting thing. Is you say I'm wrong, that this transition and recovery is not going to happen, which is great. I don't mind that at all. But my experience on South Africa has been doing the stuff that short-term trends are not a good basis for long-term prediction. And small changes in present circumstances bring across dramatic shifts. And, we predicted the Zuma era, and we predicted the hardship that would bring. And we did that while Mbeki bestrode the earth like a colossus. The economy was growing at 5%. We had a budget surplus. So it would fall apart. And there was skepticism of that. And my sense as a hawk is that possibly into the longer term, the poll answers here. You're going to have a sharp contraction in South Africa now, and you're going to have very tough 3 or 4 or 5 or 6 years. But into the 2030s, my sense, if you're allowed a sense after doing this for a time, is that South Africa can surprise on the upside. Mark.
Awesome. Lourens, I think the next one that sort of feeds into that, and we asked a question about those that are thinking about taking assets out of South Africa, and obviously this really is your strong suit heading up our investment selection committee. Very interesting stats here. If you're thinking about taking money out of South Africa, where do you go with it? And top of the charts there is the stocks and shares at 50%, investment property in various primary jurisdictions favoured, cryptocurrency getting an interesting level of support, and then obviously the other category. What's your view on what you feel most South Africans that are thinking about going offshore? How are they doing it? What are they doing?
Well, there's something called TINA, which is there is no alternative. And the stock market is certainly the place currently to place assets because no one in their right mind would be anywhere near bonds. There's no yield. And when interest rates rise, as they're definitely going to, bond market's going to shatter. Cash gives no return. So the only place to place assets is within long-term blue chips, low volatility, and first world tier 1 safe haven property, brick and mortar. These assets are just not going away. It's the stuff that human beings use. So if you think about the 3 things that we typically look at investing in, it's your consumer staple goods, toothpaste, dog food, and then on the side of technology and healthcare, it's this the technology that we cannot live without. Even the medium that we're talking on today, Zoom, is something that human beings can't function without, or Microsoft Teams or whatever, we just can't function without it. So that stuff will long-term stick around. And of course, things like hip replacements and insulin and blood pressure medication, your medicine can't go away even if you do have global pullback. So within the stock market, I think big blue chip stuff that we can't look or live without. And brick and mortar in countries where the supply heavily underweighs the demand. There you'll find your gold really. Now of course, when interest rates rise, then other assets will become interesting. But certainly what we've seen is alternatives, especially with your millennial generation. This is why you've got people saying cryptocurrency. They just don't trust how traditional assets are invested. So you are going to see this rise of alternatives as well. Even us in our structures, we are seeing requests for alternatives. So certainly alternatives, predictable long-term growth equity, and brick and mortar is where I see assets to be held.
Excellent, thank you, Lourens. And just wrapping up the last couple of polls that I think people will be interested in to see what the sentiment is out there. So one of the things, and this fit into obviously one of the reasons why we're here and trying to assist clients, is that over 41% of those looking to take money out of the country are doing so, but they're doing it in their own name. So Lourens, any tips on what they should be thinking about when 60-odd% are actually looking to do it in some form of structure? What does that actually mean? Well,
firstly, say to the 40% that take money out in their own name that they're absolutely mad. You have to put a structure around your assets, mainly because you've got a revenue agency, a government here that is very greedy and they're out of cash, and they're going to find mechanisms and ways to try and tax you to death. If you look at South Africa as a jurisdiction, if you look at a citizen of this country, and my clients will know this well, as a citizen of this country, you should demand for yourself as a taxpayer, you should demand safety and security, but privately you pay for your own security booms and your own estates. You should demand good education for your children, but you're not putting them through government school. You should demand a good pension from government, but you're privately saving it in your Alexander Forbes. And of course, you should demand you should demand a good healthcare from the government, but you're privately paying Discovery for it. So if you take our 45% income tax, if you take our 15% VAT, if you take our 18% capital gains tax, if you take our 20% dividends tax, if you take our 20 to 25% inheritance tax, and factoring the other stuff that we pay for, it makes us the most expensive tax regime on the planet. And if you are not putting assets into a structure that mitigates that, you're a fool. And this is why you're seeing people that are definitely going the way of what we would call a legal structure around your assets to mitigate unnecessary taxation. Because if the only money that your taxpayer dollar does is servicing our debt, paying for grants, and servicing our state salaries, that is not a wise transition of your money into the public pocket, in my opinion.
Okay, and then the last one, just to wrap up, I'm very conscious that we've run over, but I think everyone's finding this fascinating by the volume of WhatsApps and Q&A questions that we've got coming through. So the last one really to wrap up then, and this really I can sort of pitch to both of you. So one of the questions that we asked was just about the famous sort of golden visa kind of thought, don't put my money on a plane, I'm going to put me and a family on the plane, and I'm going to leave the country behind and go and start a new life. So Lourens, you've just been talking about how you can put your money on a plane and protect it overseas. Let's say it's the worst case scenario. 75% of the people that were watching today said they either have already done their sort of golden visa or new passport or something, or they're actively thinking of doing it within the next 12 months. I think that's a damning indictment of the perception of what is predominantly a high net worth clientele and audience today, fitting into exactly what Frans has been saying. So anything you'd like to add on that to wrap us up, gentlemen?
I'll end for you and say, if you want to survive volatile emerging markets, but that's all that South Africa is. It's volatile, very volatile. You need choices, and you need choices around your assets, and you need choices about your source of income and your business, and you need choices about your children and what they can do, and you need choices about where in the world you can be. It's 4 sets of choices. The more choices you create, the more robust you become. And if you have sufficient choices across each of those sort of blocks of choices, you get yourself into a position where really this kind of global and domestic political and economic uncertainty shouldn't be something that keeps you asleep at night. And I suppose what I've enjoyed most over the years is to work with groups that get their clients to that point. And when you do that, you find yourself in a very strong and very robust position. That's it from me. Thanks for everyone. Thanks for getting me here. Maybe we'll do it again one day.
Can I ask one more question?
Yeah,
absolutely.
But I want to intro it with a story, and I hope you can indulge me just very quickly. Now, people would have heard me talk about the story, but there is a restaurant in Northcliffe in Johannesburg by the name of Thundergun, and it serves the best ribs in the country. And they started in 1968. And to this day, if you go to Northcliffe and you go to Thundergun, you're going to queue, but you're going to get excellent ribs. And in September, they celebrate their birthday. And when they celebrate their birthday, you can stick your hand in a bucket and you can go and draw a dish from 1968 that they had on their menu. You can draw it at the same price as what they charged you in 1968. And so the last time I was there, I drew a cheeseburger and I paid for my cheeseburger 80 cents. And that shows you what inflation actually looks like, okay? How the depreciation of a currency actually, because today a cheeseburger doesn't cost 80 cents. So Frans, this question for you. Here we are today, and we are probably trading at about 16 to the dollar, okay? Now, in 1968, we weren't at 16 to the dollar. We were stronger than the dollar. So the question for you now, in 2030, give us a number that you see, even with your reforms, even with the good news, where do you see the rand in 2030 versus the dollar?
Well, that's a hell of a question to end off with. Okay, you've got to have some assumptions here. One, the great global pullback happens, and that you see a flood into the timing of course important. So let's get the lowest. Let's say what's the weakest the rand's going to hit in the next decade, because if that comes very early, we might recover by then. And as a consequence, the assumption is you get a flow back into the safety of the dollar. So you have the completely opposite effect to what you'd think you'd get. South Africa is governed by a very volatile coalition that can't quite hold itself together, and observers and analysts, with few exceptions, don't understand what they're looking at. Like for many firms today, they just do not know what they're seeing in this election result. I mean, I've had calls with people who've said to me, can't you find a way to kind of, how do we save the ANC from this? And I said, look, the tipping point is far behind it already. It's on the fundamentals, can't make it. So that the sort of misunderstanding of South Africa persists. You've got a volatile coalition. You've got the strength stormed back into dollar. You've seen this evacuation out of emerging market assets. 16, I'd say that 2030, you could have a number that sits between 30 and 40 to the US dollar. There we go. I once said 20 to the dollar about 10, 15 years ago. And I can still remember, it was in Cape Town, I think at the convention center, the sort of murmur of disbelief that rolled through the audience. And I think it's a share price of the country. Thank you to both of you. I've enjoyed this.
Brilliant. Thank you very much. So, ladies and gentlemen, we're going to wrap things up there. Thank you so much for taking the time out of your busy schedules to come and listen to Dr. Franz Grenier and his excellent insight. And I could do this for hours. It's been fascinating. Thank you to our managing partner, Lourens Reichert, for, again, as always, insight into what that translates into in solutions and options. For those that have asked questions that we haven't been able to get around to, sincere apologies. We'll do our best to reach out to you directly and follow up. And if you want to learn a little bit more about how we can help you with exactly the kind of issues that have been discussed today, please don't hesitate to reach out to your inviting Holborn Assets consultant. Gentlemen, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Cheers.